Mr. President, I rise today to talk about the underlying immigration bill, but importantly to talk about a really important amendment that I hope can be brought up. I've spoken on the floor about this before and provided great detail as to why it works to ensure that we have employment verification at the workplace, why it's so important, really the critical element, I believe, in terms of immigration reform. I believe strongly that if we do not have a stronger employee verification system at the workplace, the rest of this legislation is not going to work. We're not going to have the people come out of the shadows that those who are proponents of this legislation would like to see, and I would like to see. Significantly, we're not going to be able to curtail future flows of illegal immigration. People come here to work, and it's that magnet of employment that over the years has drawn people to this great country. And if we're just going to put up more fences and more border patrol, which I support, we're not going to get at the problem. First, when people want to come here badly enough, they figure out a way to go over or under those fences. They figure out a way to go around it. That's been the story of our country. Every time we've increased enforcement, including some sectors of the border now where there's double fences, people still manage to find their way across in order to find work. Second, 40% of those who are here illegally in this country, we are told, came here legally. They didn't come across a border illegally. They overstayed their visas. And the only way to get at that problem is to ensure that we have strong workplace verifications, and frankly, the underlying bill must be strengthened in order for the legislation to work the way it's promised. I believe this amendment that I'm prepared to offer with Senator Tester, my colleague from Montana, is not just bipartisan, is not just one that has been worked through with the Gang of Eight, with the White House, with the Chamber of Commerce, with the AFL-CIO, with all the groups. We played by the rules over the last month or so to put together a good amendment. But it's one that will actually ensure to the American people that we can have an enforcement in place, both at the border and in the interior at the workplace, that will enable the rest of the legislation to work. I've made it very clear over the last several weeks that I cannot support the underlying bill unless it has those enforcement guarantees, because I can't go to my constituents, look them in the eye and say this is going to work. So I agree, our immigration system is broken. The legal system is broken, the illegal immigration system obviously is broken. But we've got to do the right things to fix it, or else the promises we make are simply empty promises. You know, they say everybody wants to go to heaven, but not everybody's willing to do the hard things to get there. This is an example of that. It's a hard thing. A lot of people don't want to see a tightening at the workplace. But it has to happen, and I think we all acknowledge that. I was part of the 1986 immigration reforms. That dates me, I know, but I was on the commission that helped come up with that, but we proposed employer sanctions, called at the time. Both in terms of the legislation, how it was implemented, those employer sanctions were never put in place. And that's one reason, although 3 million people were legalized, millions more came, up to 12 million now. This is the critical part of this legislation, and I urge my colleagues on both sides of the aisle, let's have a vote on it. If we don't have a vote on it, we will not send the necessary message to the House of Representatives of the importance of this piece of the puzzle. People said, well, why didn't you include it in the Corker-Hoven amendment, which was about a border surge? Because it needs to be and deserves to be drawn out as a separate issue, a separate debate, which we've had here on the floor. I've spoken on it before, Senator Tester has spoken on it. And we need to be sure that we can show through a bipartisan vote that, yes, we are willing to do the hard things to get to heaven, the hard things to make sure that this legislation actually works. And that's dealing with this at the workplace, which is the magnet, which is the reason people come to this country. So I would ask my colleagues on both sides of the aisle, please, let us have a vote. There's only been 10 votes out of the over 500 apparently that have been filed. Only 10 votes on this floor. Let us have a vote on this. We'll be able to do it in a bipartisan way. We'll be able to show the American people, as Republicans and Democrats, we can come together to solve big problems. And this is a big one. And if it's not solved, I will tell you it's not going to work. The pilot program for the kind of E-Verify that's in the underlying bill has been tested. And you know what the recent report says on it? 54% of those who are illegal got through the system and got a job. More than half. Why? Because the verification doesn't work. Our legislation strengthens it in a half dozen ways. Again, I've gone into great detail of this on the floor, and it's all on the record. And I've shared this with all my colleagues who are interested. And again, we've done the right thing in terms of working with both sides of the aisle, playing by the rules in terms of being sure the Gang of Eight signs off on it. It's not perfect. It's not exactly the amendment that I initially drafted, nor is the underlying legislation perfect. But it does put in place real enforcement to ensure that the legalization will not occur in the absence of enforcement, which would lead not only to fewer people coming out of the shadows, but more illegal immigration coming, as happened in 1986. The 1986 bill casts a long shadow on this place, and we've got to be sure we don't repeat those mistakes. This will ensure that we do that. I would urge my Republican colleagues, including the ranking member who has been terrific in this process, trying to work with us, to accept a reasonable list and to accept some time limits that are reasonable. I will say last July 4th, a year ago, we were kept in session in this place. I was kept in session, as was every member, and I was happy to do it. But frankly, it was regarding legislation that was more political than it was real. It never went anywhere because it was viewed as kind of a political exercise. I think both sides of the aisle would agree with that. We stayed on Saturday. As I recalled, we stayed that weekend. Here we have a historic bill before us on immigration, and we can't stay for a couple days to be sure we get through some of these amendments? That makes no sense. Members in this body know me. I'm not a partisan. I'm not a guy that normally gets up here and rails against the other party about process. But I would say both parties need to figure out a way to come together and to come up with a list of amendments that make sense to ensure that this legislation we're considering is one that not only goes over to the House with over 60 votes, but goes over to the House with the kind of substantive provisions that are going to make the legislation work so that we can tell the American people and frankly tell our colleagues in the House this is something they ought to take up because our immigration system is broken. I see my colleague from Montana is here. I would ask him, yield to him to see if he has any comments to make on this.
Well, I want to thank my, Mr. Chairman. Yeah, I want to thank my.
Without objection.
I want to thank my friend from Ohio. I just want to say this. I'm not going to speak a lot about the amendment. I think Senator Portman has laid it out very, very well. I just want to say that we've got immigration problems in this country that need to be fixed, and they need to be fixed for some time. I think the Gang of Eight has done a great job coming forth with a good faith effort with a good bill that I think heads us through that direction. I think this amendment makes that good bill even a better bill. And I would want to thank Senator Portman for his work in a bipartisan way to put forth an amendment that makes the bill better, that makes the bill work better. And I will tell you, at some point in time, there will be an unanimous consent offered on this amendment to get a vote on it. And I will hope that both sides agree that we can get a vote on this bill. And I'll tell you why, on this amendment. I'll tell you why. It makes the bill better, and it will pass. And that's what we're here to do. So I just want to thank my friend from Ohio, and I would encourage, as he did, both sides to come together to make a good bill, an even better bill, so we can pass it through Congress and get it to the President's desk. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank my colleague
Senator from Ohio.
I thank my colleague from Montana. I thank from willingness to work on this together. This was not an easy process. Let's be honest, there are a lot of people who would like not to tighten up the workplace requirements. There are people on all sides of this. The business community sometimes doesn't want to. Labor unions sometimes don't want to. Other groups are concerned about this. But the reality is, unless we have strong workplace verification provisions in place, the rest of the legislation does not work. It's a critical piece of the puzzle. I would urge my colleagues to give us a vote. Give us a chance. Let us show that we can, on a bipartisan basis, do something that will actually create the enforcement that's needed to have the rest of this legislation work. And again, I'm urging both sides of the aisle to work on this together and to come up with a reasonable list of amendments. I'm not suggesting anybody else's amendment shouldn't be offered, but I am saying that there is a way to get there. If we have to stay in, I hope members would be willing to do this on an issue this important to the American people and this important to the future of our country. With that, I yield back my time, Mr. President.